G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough, and in today's video we are doing another patron challenge where I take someone's drawing and then convert it into a 3D character, an animation, or a scene, depending on what they draw. And this one comes from Small and they have supplied a really interesting character. And the drawing that they supplied is actually super bloody cool as well. It's really well made. It's a weird jelly character with jelly hair and jelly clothes and jelly body and little drippy bits all over it. And it was a real bloody challenge to get this one to look all right. I think I spent like 5 or 6 hours just trying to figure out the shaders for this one. And it turned out to be pretty straightforward in the end, but stick around to see how I put that one together. But first, I just want to say thank you for everyone who has seen my short film so far. It's called Black Curtain, The Fear. This is the reason why this channel exists. It's a really short film. I know it's not very long, 3.5 minutes, but it's the start of something bigger, I hope. And for those who have seen it and commented, thank you. It's been really great to see everyone's feedback. If you haven't seen it yet, please check it out. But for now, let's jump into this video where I'm going to turn this little character into something a little bit more. All right, so let's start off with the sketch. All right, so the reason why I made the sketch to begin with was because although the drawing that I've been supplied is absolutely awesome, it's not quite ready for use in 3D. So I need to create a orthographic side and front view to work with. It makes it a lot easier for me to model. So let's go ahead and have a look and see how I put that one together. And then we're gonna jump into the modeling process after that. So I'll see you. All right, so to get started, we needed to actually create a brand new orthographic sketch of the character. Now, the great thing about this is that I have a really good reference to start off with. I'm not going from nothing. So creating this was actually pretty straightforward. I just had mirror turned on in Photoshop. I worked out the general proportions, and I do change it along the way as I go through this. But overall, pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Not really any thought needed for me to go through with this. The only thing I was trying to do is just match as much as I could to the reference. Now, the thing is that naturally, you end up doing it in your own sort of style of sorts. And that's pretty obvious when you see the way that I draw, which is kind of interesting. But overall, it's still really useful to do, even if it's not your drawing to begin with. You turn it into your drawing as a reference. Or if you have someone else's reference, this step is not even required, which is even better. Now, the other thing about this is that you don't really need to use Photoshop for any of this. You can use any drawing software for this. You can even use Blender's grease pencil to create your orthographic views. That being said, I just go with Photoshop because I'm already paying for the subscription. I use it for work. I use it every day, and it's what I'm comfortable with. Otherwise, I would use Critter. I would use what else? Clip Studio. I could use Procreate. You can use whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, it's nice to have something you're comfortable with. So that's the other thing. If you're comfortable with the software and you get the best performance out of your work, I guess you can say with a particular software, then go with that. Don't try and sort of follow whatever recommendations there are. If you can do better work in one software over another, just go with it. Now, the other thing to note is that you may have noticed that I did a sort of base body shape before I did the clothing. And that's for 2 reasons. For one, the original drawing does show the outline of the body underneath the clothes, so there's a bit of a silhouette going on there, so I want to keep that going on a little bit. And the other thing is that even if it didn't, I would still do that because it gives me an indication of how the clothes are going to fall on that particular body shape. That is just something I like to do. It makes it a lot easier for me to think through the process, and it just makes it a lot less stressful to try and get those proportions to be correct from the get-go because you're not dealing with all the clothing, you're not dealing with the detail. So I prefer to go with that route. So if you prefer going with another route, you can try and do that yourself. But yeah, I do recommend creating a sort of base outline of a character before you start adding clothing and all that jazz, because again, it does make it easier. It removes that extra layer of stress needed to create the clothing on top of what is meant to be a fully fleshed out body. Now, with all that out the way, we can now take this sketch and chuck it into Blender and use it as our reference for modeling the character. All right, so now that the orthographic sketch is done, the turnaround or the model sheet, no matter how you want to put it, we can now jump into Blender and start to model this one up. Now, this one is a little bit different to how I did the last patron challenge, where I basically sculpted the whole thing and then did a retopo on top. In this case, I've just decided to just straight up model it. I didn't bother with any real extensive sketching or sculpting. So In this case, it's basically straight up box modeling or poly modeling. It's a little bit simpler in that regard because the model is simpler as well. But there are some other challenges that come with it, particularly with the clothing. So again, I will talk through that in the time lapse. Let's go check it out. Okay, so jumping into Blender, the first thing you're going to need to do is bring in the reference images. Now, the reference images are brought in with a drag and drop functionality for Blender. The cool thing about this is that it doesn't actually create a physical piece of geometry with the image attached to it. It's literally in the viewport as a reference. It's just an empty, or a null as they call them in, well, they're called empties in Blender, they're called nulls in After Effects, they're called locators in Maya. But the same thing applies, is that it's a non-renderable object. So even if you have the image in the software, then it's not going to render in the final output, which makes it perfect for use as a reference. Now you can see here, I got through the base of that body pretty quickly, just from this cube. Again, I'm following the same principles I've talked about in the past with my modeling for animation workflow. Now, again, it's different for each character, so it really depends on what you're planning on doing with the character. I wanted to try and keep it as simple as possible for this particular render because I knew the complexities would come from the actual process of creating the shader. Now you'll see how difficult that was later down the track. But building the basic mesh for the body was probably the easiest part of this entire process. One, because there's no underlying detail that I need to worry about apart from maybe the toes and the fingers themselves, and the body shape is fairly flat overall. There's no like I didn't have to extrude any breasts, for instance. I didn't have to make the butt really sculpted or anything like that because the dress is covering it, so I didn't have to worry about that either, so there was less stress involved there. Now the feet are always the hardest part for me in terms of like getting the edge flow to work the way that I want to. You can see here that a good chunk of this time lapse is just getting that damn foot working. I could have gone with like a textured effect for the feet, but because it's going with a transparent shader, essentially like a glass shader, it won't serve well to sort of just have a sculpted look for the glass. It needed to be kind of actually physical. Now, the one thing I would mention about feet, especially when modeling feet, is that you're really prone to accidentally creating spirals that go all the way up the leg. Now, a spiral is basically a selection of edges that keep going around and around and around like a spiral up the leg, which can cause some really annoying deformation issues when it comes to rigging and animation. Not so much an issue with these one-off characters, but if you are planning on creating a character that is for use in animation long term for like a short film or something, you don't want to encounter any issues like that. So I recommend really inspecting the mesh once you've finished this part of the body and seeing if there's any spirals. If there is any spirals, I would recommend that you go through and try and kill the spiral in some form or another. Usually that means just deleting an edge and then sort of killing it with an n-gon or with a triangle, or just redirecting the loop somehow. So I would recommend doing that. And as you can see now, I'm just going through the body and just working through the reference. I've kept the body sleeves and stuff separate from the hands because I didn't really need to have four. Like, if I had it like as a real physical model, I would have the body, you would have the clothing of the petticoat underneath, then you'd have the coat on top. So it would end up having 3 or 4 layers of geometry for something that is just a one-shot image. I'm not going to go ahead and do that. So I've separated the upper body for the petticoat, the legs for the legs, the hands for the hands. And that way I don't have to worry so much about creating so much complexity for myself. Now the hands themselves, I've followed pretty much the same method I do for all my hands. I just create the palm first, and then I sort of work out the thumb and the loops around the thumb, and then I extrude the fingers out. That's usually how I go about it. Now the finger, like depending again on how much detail you want to have in your models, whether you're going with a low poly or high poly look, you may need to increase or decrease certain poly counts around the hand, or you may need to kill off some edge loops on the palm and on the top of the hands to prevent them from traveling up the arms. But in this case, I'm not too worried about it because the hands terminate at the wrist, and you're not going to see it, the mesh go all the way up the arms. So I don't have to worry about killing off any geometry because it won't add any benefit to a performance here or anything like that. So again, just keeping it really simple in this case. For the fingers, literally create one set of fingers, duplicate it 4 times, and then sort of work out the proportions after the fact. And in this case, I've actually decided to add some physical sort of knuckles in the geometry as well. I felt like it gave it a little bit more volume compared to not having it. So again, it's really up to you. It depends on how you see it in render. So if it looks really crappy in render, you may want to modify that. Otherwise, you may just want to add more spans, or try a different sort of edge flow approach to the setups to see if it works better in one way or another. Ultimately, I like to keep things pretty clean. I like to make sure that the palm, at least around the thumb, has enough geometry to sort of make it feel like there's a fold when you do manipulate the hands and the thumbs. But if you want to go something even simpler, then don't bother about that. Especially if you're not going to see the underside of a hand, don't bother about it. Just keep a hand looking like a hand. As long as it deforms relatively well, then you should be fine. All right, so before we jump into the modeling of the clothing, I just want to point out a few things, and I talk about it in the time-lapse as well, is that if you can find an approach that is applicable to what you want to create in terms of your style or whatever, try and find the simplest method possible before jumping into the more complexity-driven stuff. So if your character is a stylized character and you don't really think you need to simulate any clothing, then don't do it. If you think you can get away with sculpting to get the look that you want, then sculpt it and then retopo. And if you think you can just get away with modeling it without sculpting, then just do that even. You know, it just really depends on what you want to do. Particularly if you plan on just doing stylized textures, you can probably just put it into the texture itself. So yeah, that's the kind of approach I went with today. I would say that I probably spent too much time trying to figure out the clothing a little bit in this one, but you know, you live and learn, and it's all about trial and error sometimes as well. So yeah, just keep that in mind when you're modeling your own characters, that you can take pretty simple approaches and create really detailed, complex things from them. So don't think that you need to go down the super advanced route to get really great results. Okay, so for the little details surrounding the dress and the sleeves and stuff, I think I tried like 3, 4, or 5 different approaches. I started with maybe some simulation to see if I can get them to look kind of natural. I tried different kinds of extrusions to get the look that I wanted to get, all kinds of stuff. But basically all I wanted to show here with this particular section of the modeling process is that if you can achieve what you need to achieve in the simplest way possible, which is probably just going to be straight up modeling and maybe a modifier or two, then just go with that. Don't worry about trying to do the fancy thing. Like, don't try and do the simulation if it doesn't really warrant that kind of attention and detail. Unless specifically you want to simulate cloth across the entire thing that you're modeling, then it's not really worthwhile doing those sort of things. Especially if you're going down the ultra stylized route, you're better off just modeling it directly. Again, it all depends on the situation in which you're modeling your character. So if you're going with a specific style that demands that simulated realistic look, then yeah, go for that with your modeling process as part of your modeling process, that iterative process of simulation, which can be mind-numbingly annoying to do. If you have the patience for it, then go for it. If your character is sort of stylized and you pretty much kind of understand that you can probably get away with a stylized approach to the way you do the clothing, then just go with that. Just model it or sculpt it and then retopo it. Much easier to do than getting a simulation to work properly. That's all I'm going to say. Now, in my case, the solution was pretty straightforward. It was basically create one part of the petticoat frills, make sure it's arrayable. Basically, you can duplicate it across an array, and then duplicate it across an array and apply it to a curve. Simplest thing you can do. I didn't even bother really attaching it to the dress because, again, it's not really going to be simulated as a physical object, so I didn't bother really attaching it. As long as the weight paints work well enough that they look like they're connected well enough, then that's all I really cared about. And then on top of all that, I added a solidify modifier to give it a little bit of thickness so that the shader would work appropriately in the future. That was basically it for this particular method. And then it really was after that just tweaking the pattern to work and look a bit more natural. That was it. Once I established that method, I pretty much did the same thing across the board, on the sleeves, on the dress, and all that sort of stuff. And then once I'd done that, I was able to add the other touches, which were like the collar around the neck, making sure that sort of fits within the neck hole and all that sort of stuff, and making sure that that looks nice and stylized and works well with the character. And then the final touch on top of all of that was to apply the modifiers, or actually in this case, I at least applied the mirror modifier, and then I sculpted in some very light creases in the clothing. What I'll say though is that if you are unsure about the creases causing some asymmetry, because you want to have asymmetrical creases in your clothing, and you don't want to affect the mesh overall, you could technically add it as a blend shape instead of doing it directly on the mesh, so you can at least have the base mesh nice and clean for rigging. You could go with that, mate, but in this case I didn't bother doing that because I don't think it was that necessary. It's still a very clean mesh to work with, even with the creases, so it's not really going to affect the weight paints when it comes to rigging. All right, so we're about to jump into creating the face now. So again, in similar fashion to what I talked about in the previous segment, if you're going for a certain kind of style, you may want to try to approach your modeling techniques with regard to that. So what I mean is that if you plan on doing a simplistic or a stylized approach to your character, again, don't think you have to go down the ultra detailed sculpting path to get to that point. You may end up just wasting time, especially if the character is super soft or super smooth. You could probably get away with just modeling it first and then adding some final touches with a sculpt on top afterwards. So don't think you need to start from an ultra complex high poly mesh and then bring it back down with a retopo. Particularly with these kind of faces where it doesn't really lend itself to that. You're not really adding much detail, especially if we're going to go with a glassy character. The last thing you want to do is add lots of like ripples and detail anyway, because all you're going to get is just really a lot of distortion in the shader. So keep that in mind. So yeah, let's check out the method that I've gone with the face today, and I'll see you after that to talk about the shading, which is probably the most difficult part of this whole process. All right, so just jumping into the face here. I took a slightly traditional approach for this one. I didn't bother doing any sculpting, so unlike the previous video where I sculpted the entire body, basically, this one's all pretty much box modeling and a combination of poly modeling and box modeling. So with the face, this is just a straight up box model of the face. The reason being is that for this face, it's fairly simplistic, so not much detail in the face. So I didn't feel like it really warranted that kind of attention. The other thing was that I really wanted to keep the stylized look of the eyes going on in the final render. So that meant I didn't really want to have physical eyes in the render. Partly because I knew that because it was going to be a transparent, glossy, sort of jelly-like character, if I added physical eyes in there, no matter whether or not they were like circular or oval or whatever, you would actually see the entire eye, or at least part of the eye, behind the skull or behind the skin, and that would look pretty horrible. So there was that issue as well. So in the end, I wanted to go with a textured approach for the eyes. Eventually, I actually bring it into After Effects and add the eyes there, so I'll show you how that works as well. For the mouth, I tried doing a physical mouth because, again, I wasn't sure whether or not it would work. I ended up just staying the course for the time being, partly because it kind of gave me the shape that I wanted, and I wasn't sure if I would encounter the same kind of issues that I would expect from the eyes. And I ended up doing that because I ended up adding a mouth bag thinking, oh, I'm going to add some teeth and some tongue and all that sort of stuff, but I ended up not doing that in the end. But you still see the mouth bag in the render, so you have to actually figure out a way to occlude that in the shader, which is a bit frustrating, but otherwise I figured it out in the end. But yeah, keeping it really simple in this case because one, the reference is really good, so I felt like sculpting was a bit unnecessary, and two, I still wanted to keep it relatively stylized. So and thirdly, it was so simple that it didn't really warrant a sculpt, so that's why I went with this approach. I could do it differently in the future, but yeah, in this case, just kept it really simple. That being said, I did still keep some relatively decent edge flow going on around the mouth and around the nose. because I still wanted to keep the volumes there. So as you can see, once I've got those volumes working in the mesh, I do some light sculpting to try and get the cheeks looking a bit more puffier, a bit more youthful. Those are the sort of sculpts I do in a lot of the cases where I create characters like this. I don't bother doing it from scratch, but you can still sculpt on a base mesh. That's the thing. So that's how I went with this. For the hair, really simple. It's just a bunch of edges with a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier, and then just duplicating those edges and then just sort of working our way through all the hair bits. I didn't bother with any sort of hair particles or any fancy pants stuff like that because I didn't think it warranted it. And again, it's so stylized that working with hair follicles would have been even more difficult than doing this. So keeping it really simple here. And you can see we get through it pretty quickly. I think the hair was probably one of the quickest parts I did in the entire model. And then finally with the ears, it's just a straight up extrusion, make them look pointy. And again, I didn't go through too much detail with the ears because they end up getting covered by the hair anyway. So I didn't really want to bother with that. All right, so we got the model done. The character's ready to roll. The hair's all done. The clothing's all good. The face is looking great. Now it's onto the shading, which is probably the most annoying, difficult part of this whole process. Getting glass to look good on a character, or just glossiness or transparency or whatever you want to call it, just gooey, is really difficult, especially with Blender. I've always had issues with glassy objects in Blender because there's a bunch of reasons for that. Particularly that the glass shader in Blender is really dependent on the scale of things, the thickness of things, and all sorts of crap like that. But also, it's just got weird behavior, in my opinion. Anyway, the point is, with regard to the shading of the character, I had to end up doing a bit of a hacky approach where I would figure out halfway how to get to the shading quality that I want through the shader, and then I'd have to go into the compositor to change things a little bit more. So what I end up doing is having sort of this half-baked sort of shader in Blender, render it with cycles, and then I chuck it into the compositor to lighten up certain elements using the crypto matte. So there's a bunch of little details here and there that I want to show. And I didn't have a chance to time-lapse that because there was just so much trial and error regarding that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to post up the, on the screen here, I'm going to post up the node tree for the glossy shader that I used for the character, which is really simple actually. And then I'm going to chuck up the compositing settings I used to get the colors to work the way that I want. And I'm just going to work my way through that for you. And then after that, I'm going to show you the final touches. So keep that in mind. Let's just jump into the node tree to show you exactly what that looked like in both regards, in the shader and in the compositor. And then I'll jump into the time lapse, the final touches regarding that. After all that, of course, I jump into After Effects to do some further comp. So I bring it in to do some color grading and all sort of stuff. I won't really touch on it that much in this video, but if you are interested in some color grading / compositing tutorials, please let me know in the comments because it is quite a niche thing to talk about that. And I'm not sure if there's enough people that would be interested in it. So please let me know. But other than that, let's jump in and have a look. Okay, so the shader for the model is actually really straightforward. When I look at it, after all those hours of just playing and tweaking and all sorts of stuff, I found this was the simplest way to do it. So, just a basic principle shader. I've got the face selected here at the moment. And basically, to hide away the mouth bag, I've got this geometry node with backspacing hooked into a color ramp. And that acts as a mask to mask out the visibility of the mouth bag underneath the face. In terms of everything else, it's just some basic tweaks with the shader to get what I need. So particularly with the specular, the roughness, and the transmission, basically anything that's back facing is black, anything that is front facing is white, and therefore the transmission is 0 or 1. So obviously, if you can see the face, that's a value of 1. So that's why I've got that hooked into the transmission, which is basically what a fancy word for glass. And then I add a clear coat on top of the roughness. So I got a 50% roughness there on the face. And then I add a clear coat on top of that to give it a bit more of a glossy feel on top of the roughness. So the roughness helps to settle the glass a little bit so it's not so crazy, where it's like really, really glossy. So if I turn down the roughness on all of it, you'll see that it starts to look really, really odd and really glossy. So I need to soften that out a little bit with a bit of roughness here. And then I also include some roughness in the actual glass transmission as well. So I pumped that up to 1 as well, at least with the face. And then with the clear coat allows me to bring back some glossiness by adding a second layer of gloss. So that's what clear coat's all about. Pump up the clear coat, bring the roughness down to 0, and that's what allows me to keep those specular bits and bobs around the face. And again, that's basically it when it comes to the shader node for the body. Okay, so I just want to show you what the difference is between the raw render and the sort of color graded composited render in Blender. So I still edit this further in After Effects, but it's worth noting that there's no such thing as a perfect render out of the box. You will always need to have some level of color grading or compositing before you export it out to whatever you publish to. So here's a raw render here. And if I switch over to what I had composited and color graded inside of Blender, I get this, where it looks a lot different. The face is a lot more present. We see some darker shadows in between things, and things are looking a little bit more contrasty. Let's have a look at the original again. And even then, like, the face is so saturated and so like mixed in with the geometry, it's ridiculous. So it's always worth going through and just sort of tweaking what you can. And you don't even have to do this inside of Blender. You can do this in Photoshop or in whatever software you want to do the edit in. But this is how I did it in Blender. I have my render layer here with all my passes enabled. So you can see here, I've got my combined. I've just got a few things: ambient occlusion, shadow catcher, object material, and that's it. Okay, so how does this help with the actual process of creating these color grade? Well, you're basically mixing and matching different things. So for instance, I've got my image here. I pump it into a few crypto mats along the way. So every material here has its own assigned random color, and this is where all these crypto mat things come into play. And you can see here it's detecting the hair and the body and all that sort of stuff, and I gave them their own sort of slight color grade, so I can color correct certain areas of the body, as you can see here, the dress, the hair, the body, etc. Do my hue sat changes, do some other sort of color grades there, and then I just recombine them with an alpha over in the mix. So once I've combined them all through the nodes, it sort of recombines it into a single image. And then I've also used the ambient occlusion to keep the shadows around the hair and around the little nooks and crannies. And then I mix that into the model as well, into the render, sorry. And then once I've done that, I sort of apply a sort of basic color balance to the whole thing to kind of settle the colors a little bit, a few curves to bring back some contrast, and then I add a glare node to get a little bit of, well, fake bloom going on there as well. And that's basically how I did the composite for at least out of Blender, and then I do a little bit more inside of After Effects with some just basic contrast and all sorts of stuff. But that's how I do it. If you want to see more about this, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to talk about how the compositor works to some degree. There are plenty of videos out there on YouTube about it, but yeah, if you want my sort of spin on it, just let me know in the comments. Okay, so working on the final touches here, I noticed that my proportions were a little bit off, so I used soft select with the whole lot of geometry selected, and everything's set to connected on the soft select. That allows me to sort of manipulate everything at once, which is really cool in Blender. It's a pretty unique thing. I don't think Maya lets you do that, like edit between multiple models. That's a fairly recent thing in Blender as well, last year or two. Since 2.8, you can do that. But once I've done that, I bring it into Mixamo because I'm going to use the Mixamo add-on to auto rig it. So I'm going to get the rig from Mixamo. I bring it into Blender. And then there's an actual add-on by Adobe that you can download for free. You don't even need to sign up with an account. They can download and then convert Mixamo rigs into a control rig, which is really cool. And here I am actually bringing in the eyes ripped out from the illustration as images as planes. And now I'm trying to work out the shader. Now, on and off, I jump between a bit of modeling and a bit of shading here and there because I like to sort of play as I go when it comes to these sort of stages. So as you can see here, I've now come to terms with the fact that I can no longer work with a symmetrical model. So now I'm adding all the slime bits. Some bits I actually physically model, other parts I sculpt using a multi-res modifier, as you can see on the right side of the screen there. So it's really up to you how you approach it. If I really wanted to do it in a sort of more, I guess you can say, procedural way, I could also take the model into something like Substance Painter and paint in the materials and the cut texturing and all sorts of stuff, and essentially create a displacement map. Another thing I can do is sculpt it here in Blender, generate a displacement map from that, like bake it down, and then I could probably bring it into Blender again as a baked map and then just use it as a displacement map. So there's a bunch of different ways you can go about doing those sort of details. Once I've done that, I am reskinning the rig to the new Mixamo rig. So it's already been converted. It's like literally a one-click solution. And then I actually recorded myself doing a little pose in the Rococo Live AI sort of mocap system they have. You can actually do that for free as well. And then I actually added that animation from Rococo into Blender, combined it with my Mixamo rig, and then edited the animation after the fact. So even when you get mocap, it's worth going through and cleaning things up and getting the style that you want. So I just couldn't be bothered doing it from scratch. So I just literally recorded myself doing the pose in the living room, and it worked amazingly. And then of course I still had to animate the hands and still had to animate some parts of the legs and retime a few things to get it looking the way that I wanted for this particular video. But yeah, it worked out really, really well. It was a great experiment for going forward in the future with some new personal projects. So of course the last Black Curtain episode, if you want to call it, that was all hand animated from scratch. Everything was done by scratch with that one. In the future, I just can't afford the time to do that every single time I want to do a short film. So I'm thinking I'm going to use AI mocap, clean it up in Blender, and then add my own personal touches on top of the mocap, which is how you would normally do it anyway. And then finally, once I've got the animation here, I actually end up rendering out the animation from Blender. I do my color grading inside of After Effects with an EXR multi-layer, and then I export out the video. So I will show you a few extra bits and bobs after this time lapse of how I got there. So there's a few node trees in the compositor in Blender that I have to show you, because the actual render from Blender Raw looked way too saturated, way too pink, all that sort of stuff. And the only way I could fix it easily was through the compositor. So that's how I went about it with this. And then finally, some final touches in After Effects. So I actually end up replacing the eyes in After Effects using 3D nulls, exported out from Blender and tracking it with the image and bringing that in with a camera. And that allowed me to track the model to the eyes, or the eyes to the model, which I got this final result. All right, so after all that, here is the final result. So what do you think? I think it looks pretty cool. I'm quite happy with the result. I think I could probably do a little bit better with the shader in the future, but as a experimental sort of project, I think it came out pretty cool. What I really like is the AI driven mocap, which worked amazingly well. And then once you edit it further, it comes together really, really, really well. So I'm looking forward to exploring that more in the future. Okay, so that's the end of the video. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you really like this video, please give it a like, please subscribe. And if you want to get even more out of this, so the ad-free videos and other source files from all kinds of stuff that I've done in the past, even source files from my short film, please sign up to my Patreon. I really appreciate it. Other than that, I'm going to leave you guys to it. So, catches and have fun. Cheers.